And in fact, one of the shows that's going to be available at launch is called the Imagineering Story. Do we know what the Imagineers are? Do we know who they are? Yes. So the Imagineering Story chronicles 65 years of history at the Walt Disney at the Walt Disney Imagineering. So that means we've got stories about the people, stories about the craft, also stories about the business. It's footage that you've never seen before from Disney parks all around the world. We have Disney Parks fans in here, right? Yes. So let me tell you a little bit about the Imagineering Story before we bring folks out. The Imagineering Story is created by Academy Award and Emmy-nominated director and producer Leslie Iwerks. She is here with us today, all right? Yes, and she's actually, so she's the granddaughter of the gentleman who was the animator and co-creator of Mickey Mouse and Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. So creativity obviously runs in the Iwerks family. So Leslie's directed films including Recycled Life, which was nominated for an Academy Award, and The Pixar Story. We're fans of Pixar, right? Yep, which was nominated for an Emmy for Best Nonfiction Special. Everybody please make some noise for Leslie. Leslie's coming on out. Welcome, Leslie. And so, joining Leslie for this conversation is Bob Weiss. Now, Bob Weiss is the president of Walt Disney Imagineering. He also appears in the film and is an amazing source of knowledge about all things Disney parks and experiences. So I know this crowd will love him. Everybody, please welcome Bob.
Hi everyone, how's everyone doing today? Joining your D23 experience? So, who's heard of Imagineering? Of course you have. We're here today to announce the 6-hour, 6-part series on Disney Imagineering, which has been a 7-year journey for me. And it's been an honor to work with Bob Weiss and the whole team of Imagineers in Glendale and across the world. And
we're so excited about this because of Leslie's talent and her energy, her 7 years of following us, and for you all to see the most in-depth view of Imagineering that's ever been recorded. I think it's just, you're going to love it. It's going to be amazing.
And we've been given unprecedented access to the parks, behind the scenes at Imagineering for, as I said, almost 7 years. And I've interviewed probably over 250 people for this whole series. And we have some interesting stories to tell you. But among the most interesting stories, an announcement I'm making here today at D23, which is our narrator. The wonderfully talented Angela Bassett is our narrator. And with that, we want to show you the exclusive first 2 minutes of this series that is going to be debuted, as we said, on November 12th on Disney+. This is the first time anyone's seen this opening of the film, and look forward to your thoughts afterwards.
Have a look. You know, we're so inspired by Leslie and her work on this. For a lot of you that know about Imagineering, we are a think tank creative company that was founded by Walt Disney himself, and we've been in continuous operation since Walt founded us, and we have creative responsibility around the world for parks and cruise ships and resorts and consumer products and publishing and so many things. But as Leslie said, we gave her 7 years ago completely unprecedented access to talk to Imagineers, to visit sites. She visited Shanghai multiple times. She visited all the parks. She spoke with just many Imagineers, executives, people who have been involved in our projects. And I think through it all, you've managed to do something that is completely unique, which is to really tell our story from what we feel is the heart. How did you do that? How did you capture that so well?
Well, I think you know, we've seen a lot of stuff about Imagineering in books and whatnot, and what we wanted to do is really tell the human story behind Imagineering and really understand sort of the trials and tribulations that have gone into almost 70 years of Imagineering history, and this film started out as a 90-minute film back in 2013 or 2014. Marty Sklar had invited me to Imagineering to screen the Pixar story, which I directed. And after screening that, he said, when are you going to do the Imagineering story? So I said, well, you tell me, I'd love to do it. So of course that was the beginning of, working with Marty on creating the outline for this project, creating the storyline, really finding our arc of the story over this, at that point, almost 65-year history. So we did that and then started filming, and what was supposed to be a 90-minute film turned into a 5-year commission project to literally travel around the world to the parks and shoot behind the scenes and interview all these amazing Imagineers. So through that process, it was just about finding the human story to all of this. And I mean, these Imagineers are so amazingly passionate and creative and dedicated to the DNA of Walt Disney that it was just almost inevitable and easy for us to tell the personal story.
We realized pretty early on that even for those of us that have been around Imagineering for decades, that she had collected such a deep story and so much material that none of us had ever seen, that had never been seen by the public before. We realized early on that it was much larger than the original assignment. The scope of what you had created was so much larger. And the interesting thing is that this was long before Disney Plus. It was you were looking at these rough cuts and saying, where should we take this? Because this is really multiple programs, and we're just so excited that we've found a home here for it.
That was really lucky because we had to do a 90-minute film, but we seriously had like 6 hours of content. We kept going into Walt Disney Imagineering and taking tapes off the shelf and going back and just going through everything. And I mean, I think our archival producer counted 82,000 elements of archival material that we have sifted through. We've used, out of all of that, 2.5%. So if that gives you the scope of how much material that we've actually gone through between the photo archives and Imagineering. I mean, an amazing team of archival folks who have helped us with this. We've pulled things out of the vault, we've restored, we've pulled stuff from original negatives and done 2K scans on material that hasn't been seen in 50 years. Stuff that goes prior to 1966. So it's going to be a real treat, I think, for a lot of people who haven't seen so many of these photos and footage before.
It's really a journey. I think you'll find in this program that throughout the decades of Imagineering, the Imagineers believe in what we do for the audience and for our guests, and there's a strong, heartfelt connection, almost a sense of mission that we're a part of the legacy that was started by Walt. We're a part of a global legacy of Disney magic, and we take that responsibility very seriously, and I think you captured that. But interestingly, you've never been an Imagineer, but you have a strong connection to us. Can you talk a little bit about your personal connection, your entree into this story?
Sure. Well, I can say that my last trip to Shanghai Disneyland, I was given an honorary Imagineer hard hat, so that was like a highlight. But no, I mean, my father and grandfather, Iwerks, my grandfather, and my father, Don Iwerks, go back to the Disney company 1919 really, with my grandfather with Walt Disney and co-creator of Mickey Mouse and inventor, pioneer of technical work at the studio. In fact, there's a book coming out on my grandfather in the fall called The Genius of Iwerks, Walt Disney's original inventor. So I have, that sort of legacy in my family of just learning about this. And I grew up behind the scenes at Disney with my dad. He ran the machine shop at the studio, and he was involved in all the projection systems and camera systems that went into Epcot, Walt Disney World, Tokyo, you name it. So I was always like a little kid going along the back lot of the Disney studio, and seeing all these camera systems that were being built, and then going to Epcot and going to the parks behind the scenes. So as a kid, that was my backyard in a way. And so to this many years later, be asked to tell the authentic story, the real unprecedented story of Imagineering, was a real honor for me. So it's like coming full circle.
There's a lot of high drama. I hesitate to call this a documentary, even though it's a beautiful term, but this is a very dramatic piece that takes you through some amazing stories in the company's history, including the going out and really surreptitiously finding the land to build Walt Disney World, and Walt's vision to go out and expand there, and then Walt Disney passing away unexpectedly before that could be built, and Roy carrying that vision beyond that. There's so many great dramas in this piece. What are the ones that really gripped you? I'm sure they all did, but what are some of the examples you think?
I mean, I think what really surprised me was at the end of Tokyo was the near-death experience of Imagineering itself, when there was no real plan for the future beyond Epcot and Tokyo. And that was a really intense period of time of turmoil within the company because of the green mail scandal and the almost takeover of the Disney company. And so that was a major turning point for the Walt Disney Company when it almost got bought out and sold in pieces and parts. Could have been sold in pieces and parts. So everything you're seeing here in this D23 may not have ever existed for that crucial point. So that was a real interesting time, and we interviewed the former president of Imagineering, Carl Bongiorno, who was very influential in helping to save that time frame, keep these Imagineers on staff.
Yeah, when you think about Imagineering's history, a time period like Epcot, Leslie mentioned, at that time the company was much, much smaller, and so the investment in Epcot was a huge, huge commitment, and it was a difficult project. We think of it as a great project today, but it was a difficult project to execute. It had plenty of challenges, and it was really on the verge of the company being broken by it. And another interesting, I think, that you captured is that the CEOs, you know, certainly going back to Walt, who started Imagineering, and to Ron Miller, to Michael Eisner, to Bob Iger, we have always had a very close relationship with the CEOs because they have seen us as a technology and an innovation center. And in many ways, I think they use us as their lab for a vision to carry the company forward.
Yeah, I think when you look at the overarching legacy from Walt Disney to Bob Iger and all the CEOs that have run this company and how they inspired Imagineering in many ways and how Imagineering inspired them. I mean, the interview with Bob Iger recently was just really telling, and how much he's inspired by everything that Imagineers do, and that creative relationship of challenging Imagineers to do things that they've never done before has continued to exist through this whole 70-year history, I think.
Yeah, interestingly, you interviewed many of us in Shanghai, Cars Land, other parts around the world, and one of the interesting things you see is that you see many of us today struggling with the same things that our forebears struggled with. So she has fantastic profiles of Mark Davis and others who you know are really the founders on which we have built Imagineering, and they dealt with many of the same issues that we deal today. You're always trying to push hard. You're always trying to get the best product you can. You always feel like it's a hard job. It's a difficult budget, difficult schedule, but somehow every generation has dealt with that.
Yeah. And Bob started out in Tokyo Disneyland. Maybe you can talk about just what it was like back then, but how have you traversed your whole career to now becoming president of Imagineering? That's an amazing rise.
Well, I think at that time that Epcot was happening, all of the company's resources were focused on Epcot because Epcot was so critical to the company's survival. And a group from Japan came over and said, we'd like you to build a park in Japan, and the company almost didn't do it. And the reason was we didn't have the resources. But they decided, well, if a small group of people can go over there and make it happen, that's okay, as long as it doesn't upset Epcot. So that's where I started. And then,
how many people have been to Tokyo Disneyland, by the way?
Tokyo out there? Oh, great.
Yeah.
And just think about it, that it almost didn't happen because the company didn't think we had the resources. But it was through the perseverance of a few people at Disney and also the early executives from what would become the Oriental Land Company that had it really happen. And you tell that story. And there was a lot of drama associated with whether the company could really do its first foreign theme park at that time. And that really opened up the opportunity to do Paris, and eventually to do Hong Kong, and eventually to do Shanghai, which you covered very extensively.
Yeah, so Bob oversaw the entire Shanghai Disneyland construction, a monumental achievement in my opinion. I don't even know how you did it.
I don't either.
Has anybody been to Shanghai Disneyland yet?
Any Shanghai folks? Yeah.
Isn't it amazing? Pirates of the Caribbean ride, I think the best ride in the world.
But I think there were times when you were there to interview people, when those of us who were living and working in Shanghai, there were days that you woke up when you thought, we will never finish this. It was that hard. Just because we were working, trying to do something we had never done before in an environment where we had never built a Disney park before, and that struggle was difficult, and I think that's the kind of drama you've been able to capture in your work.
I know somebody compared the building of Shanghai more like the building of Anaheim back in the day of Walt, when he had a whole new plot of land and it was an unforeseen area and it was like all brand new. Somebody, and maybe it was Howard Brown, that said, you know, it feels like it's more almost like going back to the original vision of Anaheim and starting over again in a whole new way. You know, to be on the ground and witness Bob and all these different Imagineers working so hard building this castle and just taking it to a whole new level, the largest theme park, right? And the largest castle. Everything was big.
It's all big. I think another thing you've done so well, Leslie, is Imagineering is a very collaborative environment. We have across artists and writers and people who invent technologies and people who invent ride systems. Anything we do, if you look at Galaxy's Edge as an example, involves so many different people. In fact, I think recently we looked at Galaxy's Edge and thought that between here and Florida, there were upwards of about 12,000 people involved in executing on Galaxy's Edge. But all those different disciplines has traditionally made Imagineering feel like a little university, because there's so many different kinds of people mixed up, and it's a little bit quirky too. And I think you captured a lot of that.
So many disciplines under one roof. I don't know how many disciplines you would say you have, but a lot.
Lots of different disciplines, and everybody believes in what they're doing. There's you know, an engineer who's maybe designing a new ride, like the Millennium Falcon ride, Smuggler's Run, could be in lots of other businesses, but you find that the people that come to Imagineering are there because they love it, and they love trying to do things that they can then take their families to, and they can ride it. It makes a difference. It's very unique in that sense.
One of the favorite things I got to do on this film was, which sounds normally boring in the film industry, but was to scout for interview locations. And that meant going behind the scenes and all the attractions and Pirates and Small World, and working with Kim Irvine inside Small World, and I interviewed Marty Sklar inside Pirates of the Caribbean at 4 in the morning when we could shut it down and actually light it properly. Kind of seeing the craft really behind the scenes inside these attractions when they're not running was really kind of an eye-opener for me too, which is just the level of craftsmanship and technology that goes on behind the show, behind the curtain. We've covered, you know, from the original Disneyland and the development or the creation of Imagineering all the way through Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. So it's covering the entire 70-year span over 6 episodes that will really show you all the innovation, the storytelling, the human stories. You know, Rolly Crump. How many of you know Rolly Crump? All right. Awesome, good. So really, Crump in our interview, he said, you know, Walt started a whole new industry, but what he did that was different than anybody else was he made it human. And that's exactly what everyone's still doing today, is really making this human. Because I've never seen a more passionate audience for this subject than the Disney fans. I've done a number of documentaries on a number of subjects, but nothing compares to Disney and Imagineering. And I think, going back to your question earlier about like how do you make it human, well, this was in my blood too, and I'm as big of a Disney fan as anybody, and I feel like it's in my blood too, and I just feel so strong about the company and about Imagineering, and just feel like it's part of my DNA as well, so it's been fun.
As you said, Marty Sklar was the one who originally saw the Pixar documentary that you did, reached out and explored the idea of producing a documentary about Imagineering. How does Marty appear in this story? What was the sort of the unique perspective that you found in terms of, obviously, if you know about Marty Sklar, he led this company for many decades and was really other than Walt, I'd say that Marty Sklar was really the other true founder of Imagineering.
I think, well, Marty, you know, as I said, was the one who said, when are you going to do the Imagineering Story? So it all started with Marty. And my collaboration with Marty early on was back and forth on email and phone, and I went to meet him at his house, and we talked through the whole storyline, and he was really the keeper of the flame, I think, for Imagineering, and I think he really wanted this legacy to be preserved, and he really saw the value in going back and not only recording the history now, but going back through the archives and finding the old material and bringing it back up so that everybody has a perspective on just how deep the roots go in this company. So Marty was super influential, and he's just always been a family friend of ours, and you know, this wouldn't be here without him.
Yeah, and Marty was dedicated to the people, to the guests certainly, but also dedicated to the Imagineers and to running a creative culture that Imagineering had a responsibility to be constantly trying to do new things. You couldn't just do something that was okay, you know, you had to do things that are great.
Yeah, and Marty talked about how people would just pitch ideas, you know, the fun around Imagineering, and during his creative reign over those years was people would just like go sit on the ground on their back and like pitch something for some ride, or, you know, like it was just all super fun, and the creative spirit was so big, and it seemed like Marty had a real handle on the Disney DNA. I mean, he did that blue book, which was after Walt died, he created what was called a blue book. It was Walt's philosophies for Disneyland, and he made sure that every Imagineer read this book, because it was all about the DNA and the philosophies of what makes Disneyland special and what is that Disneyland thinking. And I think that was his way to help preserve the legacy going forward, the DNA going forward. But
we said that Imagineering is a hallway culture, and by that we meant for many years we would use these great big storyboards, just like animation, where you'd pin all the ideas up, and most people didn't have room enough in their office for these storyboards, so they'd sit them in the hallway, and somebody else would come along and look at it in the hallway and give you notes or ask you questions, and somebody else would come along and say, oh, you know, you could do this too. And the culture is still in many ways a culture of people hanging around, challenging each other, and very informal. And that was really important to Marty, I think, and to all of us even today, to have a company that feels creative, feels innovative, but also feels comfortable, feels like a family, feels like a small university that if you came over, if any of you came over to see Imagineering right now, you won't see a lot of guys in suits in cubicles. It's just not our culture. It's very informal, always has been.
I think it's, you know, when Walt Disney used to do his Wonderful World of Color TV shows, the Disneyland Story, you know, he'd be behind the scenes talking about Imagineering. But Michael Eisner sort of took over that as well for a while. But you really haven't seen a ton of that in the way that we've been allowed to reveal so much new information. And I hope that continues, you know, because I think people really do like to see what's going on behind the curtain, so to speak. And you know, another thing too is just seeing the level, the innovation of animatronics since the original Lincoln up through Avatar has been fascinating to document. And you think about the technology. I mean, Imagineers are always at the cutting edge, if not at the future of technology catching up to it. Now with smartphones and all the technology that we have today, it seems like it's getting harder. It's harder and harder, but you're still innovating and doing it. And that's always what's marvelous to me. But I grew up with, my dad's hand was actually Lincoln's hand. I don't know if you knew that.
Right?
Yeah, so his hand was a model for Abraham Lincoln. So we always had this rubber hand around our house, and I used to like put it under the couch or have it sticking out of the refrigerator door or whatever. But I mean, that to me was like the magic of being an Imagineer. It was just sort of this quirky fun of you know, being a part of this amazing group. So I was just a kid, but I think anyone that could be Imagineer today are quite lucky.
Yeah. A lot of you may not know that, and you cover this, that the early Imagineers all came out of animation. And so when Walt started Imagineering, he knew he wanted to create Disneyland. He didn't know where he was going to do it yet or exactly what it was going to be. But the people he brought in were people he borrowed basically from the studio. And so his best animation brain trust in many ways became what Imagineering was.
You think about like keyframes and stuff that we're so used to today, all that was just animation. You get to like, you know, that was the cutting edge of technology, and that you didn't have animation, you didn't have keyframe technology like you do today. It was all cam machines and things, and what they were able to do back then is just remarkable.
Do you all know what the original name of Imagineering is? WED. You do know it's WED because it was actually founded by Walt outside of the studio with his own money as his own research lab, and so he called it WED for his initials, Walter Elias Disney.
Yep. So does anybody have any questions?
Questions about it? Sir, ma'am.
Well, the question was, what new stories, as we were unveiling everything, did we find out about? I think that one of the least talked about storylines, is, for me anyway, was just the underlying drama that befalled Imagineering as they were creating all these parks. So I was looking at basically 3 levels of storytelling. One was the Imagineering story, the personal story of these individual Imagineers and where they came from and what their background was and all that. And the second layer was the task at hand, which was building a park, and how are they going to do it in an ingenious new way, and what were the challenges with that. And then the third level of conflict, in a way, was the overarching story of the company, the CEOs, the leadership, and how that was influencing Imagineering. And with those 3 narrative threads, there was always drama, you know, that interwove between those. And so I found that by interweaving those, you could really bring the human story out, rather than it just being about how we did this one project, but you also have the conflict underneath of time pressure or financial pressure or a decision that maybe wasn't the wisest decision at the time, but they were still working within that framework or what have you. So those were always the things that I found interesting, and then of course layering in all the creativity and the technology within that.
And for those of us that have been there for a while, it was fascinating that she was able to put into words and images our memories of how things happened, but it wasn't because we told her that. She found that story. Your journey discovered that and discovered it in great detail, which is exciting.
Yeah, I mean, it was, you know, I always think documentary filmmaking is like peeling away layers of an onion, you know, and you're constantly finding new things until you get to a kernel of something, and then you're going, okay, I'm going to follow this thread for a while. And then you interview somebody else, and then you ask them the same question, and then they tell you something different. And then you go and you interview another person, and you know, pretty soon you've got this tapestry, you've got this whole storyline that you didn't know was going to happen. So those are fun moments. And once we went from this being an Imagineering project and it was brought over to Disney Plus, led by Dan Silver, the story notes were so fantastic, with Agnes Chu and Dan really looking at this and saying, how can we make this even stronger and better? And I think their notes really helped it make it even more human and stronger. And so I think it's just a really great collaboration between yourself and the Imagineers, giving notes, and then Disney Plus. So now what we're bringing to fruition is hopefully the best minds on it.
Yeah, we're very, very thankful and excited that Disney Plus team saw the brilliance of your work and saw how this would be such an awesome addition to the launch of Disney Plus. We're so proud to be a part of it, and we're so thankful to you, Leslie, for doing such an amazing, brilliant job of capturing who we are.
Well, my honor, and I want to thank Mark Catalina, who's here today, who's our writer-editor, and he's just brilliant and really helped to build this out. So, where's Mark?
There's Mark.
Somewhere. Anyway.
I was up there. Hey, Mark.
There's Mark.
Yeah.
So we had a really great team in my company, Santa Monica, and it's just been a thrill. I'm just bummed that we're finishing it up. Hopefully there'll be more episodes.
Well, thank you, Leslie, and we're looking forward to seeing it. Thank you so much, Leslie.
Thank you.